Separation or Reconciliation? The Nationalities Question in the USSR by Igor Shafarevich. First published in From Under the Rubble, edited by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. First published by the YMCA Press of Paris in 1974. Separation or Reconciliation. Of all the urgent problems that have accumulated in our life, the most painful seems to be that concerning relations between the various nationalities of the USSR. Footnote. There are 15 Union republics and over 100 different nationalities in the USSR. Translator. End of footnote. No other question arouses such explosions of resentment, malice, and pain. Neither material inequality, nor lack of spiritual freedom, nor even the persecution of religion. Here are some examples. In our Central Asian cities, I and many others have often heard the cry, "Just wait till the Chinese come. They'll show you what's what." This is said as a rule by moderately educated people, who cannot be unaware of what the arrival of the Chinese would entail for them, if only on the basis of what happened to the Kyrgyzians, who were lucky enough to get away after being deprived of all their possessions and driven out of China. And the Tibetans, for example, according to the radio, were subjected to mass castrations. They know all this, but they say it all the same. Evidently, the pitch of emotion is more powerful even than the instinct of self-preservation, as in the Western Ukraine in 1941, when detachments of the Ukrainian Nationalist Union harried the retreating Soviet forces, and their officers made deals with the Germans, although they could not have failed to foresee, on the basis of the experience of the Poles, what in fact actually happened 6 weeks later: the arrest of the entire officer corps and the liquidation of most of the detachments. One gets the same impression when one compares the treatment of the national question in Samizdat with that of other seemingly no less burning problems. The fate of those imprisoned in the labor camps, for instance, or the incarceration of the sane in mental hospitals. It is noticeable that the authors of the vast majority of Samizdat works voluntarily keep within certain limits, observe certain self-imposed restraints. They do not incite hatred or envy of the better off, or advocate violence. It seems that certain lessons of the past have been so thoroughly assimilated that they have set unshakable new standards of thought. Yet, when the nationalities question comes up, these taboos evaporate. One finds indignant descriptions of one people living better than another, or, if they live worse, still receiving more than they have earned. Samizdat published schemes for the resolution of the nationalities question usually involves demands for the forcible resettlement of various populations and transparent hints that even harsher measures would be in order. One is left with the impression that, when writing about this area, the authors, on the contrary, tend to forget everything the past has taught us. Suspicion and friction between nations is not an exclusively Soviet tendency. One sees it the world over, and we can try to understand our own problems only if we recognize them as local manifestations of natural laws common to mankind. The 20th century was not expected to be the century of unprecedentedly extreme nationalism. In the last century, it was generally agreed that the national problem was withering away, that the smaller nations would slowly merge into the larger, and the differences between the large nations would gradually diminish, and that in the not too distant future, mankind would fuse in worldwide unity, perhaps even all speaking one language. The exact opposite has turned out to be the case. Countries that have lived for centuries in national accord have been engulfed by national enmities. Unexpected varieties of nationalism have appeared on the scene. Breton, Walloon, and Welsh, for example. Enmity between peoples has reached an unprecedented peak of mutual hatred, leading to the extermination of whole peoples, as in the Nigerian Civil War. That was not the 19th century's only miscalculation, not the only case where the dominant ideology of the time was diametrically opposed to the future, whose foundations it laid. At that time, it seemed that man was faced with the clear prospect of constructing a life increasingly based on the principles of humanitarianism, respect for the rights of the individual, and democracy. Russia seemed to be blocking the road of progress precisely because she was insufficiently liberal and democratic internally. Dostoevsky alone, apparently, felt in his bones that the world would suffer quite a different fate. The actual historic role of the 20th century, as it turned out, was to put large parts of mankind in thrall to an ideology that pursued the maximum suppression of the individual. Socialism, which had existed for centuries as a theory, started to materialize in the form of socialist states. This process has continued in fits and starts throughout the 20th century, expanding with almost monotonous regularity, and there is no reason to suppose it has ended yet. We should bear this basic 20th century trend in mind when seeking to understand the national question, both in our own country and in the world as a whole. At the beginning of the 20th century, the picture of the world was defined by roles played in it by the great powers, the strongest states, led by peoples inspired by a belief that they were destined to play a special role in the world. In this situation, socialist movements had the choice of two strategies: either to exploit these great nations' aspirations, their faith in their own mission, or else to suppress those aspirations. Both strategies were tried. Experience showed that although it could be useful to exploit national feeling to buttress the stability of an existing socialist state, especially in times of grave crisis and war, when it came to the seizure of power and drawing fresh nations into the socialist ideology, there was incomparably more to be gained from whipping up the ideology of anti-nationalism, especially when it was directed against the large nations and accompanied by a certain encouragement of patriotism among smaller peoples. This strategy, therefore, became the basic weapon of Marxist-oriented socialist movements, whose fundamental ideology was internationalism, the denial and destruction of patriotism, and the doctrine of the division of nations into two hostile cultures. This philosophy, so foreign to the spirit of states possessing a strong national and especially religious identity, helped to destroy them, and itself gathered strength as these states underwent periods of crisis. Whichever was cause and whichever effect, it is obvious that we have here two manifestations of a single process. The Russian Empire, standing at the foundation of orthodoxy, was the first to fall victim to this process. Then Austria-Hungary, with its thousand-year-old roots in the Holy Roman Empire. A quarter of a century later came the end of Greater Germany as a single united state, and even among the victors, the British Empire soon ceased to exist. All these political catastrophes were accompanied by vicious ideological attacks on the leading peoples in those countries, and on their claim to a special historic mission. For example, in post-war, that is, post-Second World War, Germany, their whole literature set itself the aim of demonstrating to the German people its sinfulness and ineradicable guilt before all mankind. On both the individual and the national level, repentance is one of the most uplifting emotions of the spirit, and the Germans certainly had plenty to repent. But repentance loses its point when purification is carried out with no higher end in view. Then it becomes an act of spiritual suicide. We Russians know only too well how this theme of an accursed past can deprive a nation of its history, and there would seem to be a certain symbolism in the close personal ties that exist between the German writers of this penitent generation and the politicians who seek to persuade the Germans that the greatest service they can do to the world is to reconcile themselves forever to the perpetual division of their country. In other words, accept the death of the German nation. Finally, in the USA, the savage anti-Vietnam War campaign has scarcely inspired the heightened moral sensitivity or a greater sense of responsibility. If it was, why did the genocide of the entire Ibo nation of Nigeria, which led to more deaths than the whole Vietnam War, pass almost unremarked? Even some leading anti-war figures openly admitted that the war was not the real issue. End the Vietnam War, and we'll find something else to protest about, as one of them said. One gets the impression that what the protesters were really attacking was America's claim to a special world role, a sense of being a great nation, which has still not abandoned the Americans. Whenever great empires have crumbled, national consciousness has always sharpened in the separate nations composing them, and ethnic groups have separated out and aspired to recognition as independent states. Here again, cause and effect are inseparable. National separatism both acted as a force for the destruction of the old empire and simultaneously expanded to fill the vacuum created in people's hearts by the destruction of a sense of imperial unity and a unifying purpose. A similar dual trend is increasingly apparent in the 20th century, both the destruction of great states ruled by a national idea and the fission of mankind into even smaller national units. It seems to me that if we look at the situation in this light, we have some hope of understanding why the national question is particularly explosive in our country. For the present relationships between the nationalities are the consequence of contradictory historical processes. On the one hand, the separation out of the different nations and their drive for maximum possible independence have coincided with the subordination of all life to socialist ideology. These processes have been so inextricably intertwined that in many cases it has been impossible to distinguish between the manifestations of one and the manifestations of the other. For example, tendencies towards non-Russian separatism were first deliberately encouraged as a counterweight to Russian patriotism, but then were treated as the greatest menace. On the other hand, these nationalist aspirations soon came into conflict with socialist ideology's deepest rooted tenets, hostility to the very idea of nationhood, and the drive to suppress both the idea itself and the individual human personality. In this way, the national life of many peoples has fallen victim to that very force, socialist ideology, that not so long ago assisted and encouraged them to develop a system of views expressing an intolerant, radical nationalism. So deeply has this ideology penetrated the national outlook, and so strong is its imprint that those who argue from national positions can hardly be persuaded that ideology, of all things, is the root cause of their misfortunes. This has given rise to the concept, which I consider fundamentally erroneous, underlying practically every study of the national question in our country known to me. I refer, of course, only to uncensored literature. This concept is a very simple one. All the problems of the non-Russian peoples are due, in the long run, to Russian oppression and the drive for Russification. The regions inhabited by these nations are Russian colonies. These people, therefore, have a clear task before them, to rid themselves of Russian colonial dominion. This theory has quite understandable attractions. It squeezes a complicated problem into a framework of a few simple and universally acceptable propositions. It is generally agreed that colonialism is the disgrace of the 20th century, and that colonies should become independent as soon as possible. Therefore, all you need to do is acquire colonial status in the eyes of the world, and you are at once guaranteed the automatic support of colossal forces. And this means you can also offer your people an extremely clear and simple way forward. But primitively simple solutions to complex problems do not exist. We must be careful to verify the basic premise. that non-Russian peoples of the USSR are the colonial subjects of the Russian people, not only to discover the truth, but also because a conclusion based on a false premise cannot prove a reliable guide for the peoples who propose it. The arguments generally used to demonstrate the non-Russian people's dependent and colonial status in the USSR do at first appear to carry conviction. The commonest are as follows. 1. Great riches are extracted from the territory inhabited by non-Russians and go to enrich the Russian inhabited part of the USSR. 2. The density of the indigenous populations is declining. They are being diluted. Two reasons are given: the deportation of indigenous populations in the past, and the immigration of large numbers of Russians now. Russians come as workers in the new industrial enterprises, which are often created for no good economic reason and are irrelevant to the development of the particular region. 3. National cultures are suppressed. Distinctive national tendencies in art are prohibited, and their manifestations punished. History is compulsorily rewritten so as to belittle the people's national identity. Historical relics are destroyed instead of preserved. Ancient cities and streets are given new names unrelated to the nation's past. 4. National religions are suppressed. 5. The national languages are increasingly superseded by Russian. However, these arguments take on a different aspect if we ask, could they not be applied to the Russian people as well? Let us examine them in order. 1. As some studies of the national question show, the Russian people enjoys a lower standard of living than many other peoples. The Georgians, Armenians, Ukrainians, Latvians, or Estonians. Sometimes this is explained away as characteristic of a peculiar kind of colonialism, Russian-type colonialism. Is this not an attempt to blind us to the basic contradiction with the new terminology? It seems obvious to me that this is a general phenomenon. An enormous part of the wealth produced by all the nations is not returned to them. It is easy enough to guess where it goes: on the maintenance of a vast military machine and civil bureaucracy, on space exploration, on aid to revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and most of all on making good the shortcomings of the economy. 2. Few, if any, would maintain that in the past, during collectivization, for example, the Russians were less subject to deportation than other peoples. As for the present day, attention should be drawn to a universal cause: the disproportionate development of the economy based on no nation's interest. In this cause, masses of Russians and non-Russians were uprooted and diverted from their national tasks. While documents written by Ukrainians complain of Russian migration into the Ukraine, Estonians and Latvians complain not only of floods of Russians settling in their lands, but of floods of Ukrainians too. 3. The suppression of Russian national culture began at a time when other nations were still being actively encouraged to assert their national identity. Many samizdat studies of the national question still accuse the Russians of great power chauvinism, but when this term was invented, more than half a century ago, it amounted to nothing less than an invitation to stamp out any manifestation of Russian national consciousness. In the last century, long before the state took a hand, all-powerful liberal public opinion declared Russian patriotism to be reactionary, a disgrace to Russians, and a menace to everybody. And to this very day, Russian national consciousness lives under unwinking, hostile surveillance, like a transported criminal under police supervision. Here is a recent dire warning. A group of anonymous authors published a sequence of interconnected articles, an anthology almost, in number 97 of the Vestik Roskogo Christianskogo Studentskogo Dvezhenia, the herald of the Russian student Christian movement. The Latin word forming the first article's title, and that which was meant to attract the reader at first glance in all the articles, was a call to Russia to repent. And which of all Russia's transgressions did the authors consider the most heinous? The belief, it turns out, that Russia has a historic mission, that she too has something of her own, a new word to offer the world, or, as the authors put it, Russian messianism. This is the sin they call on Russians to repent. This, they say, should be Russia's main aim in the future. Their own stated aim is so to change the nation's consciousness that it dare not imagine that its life has some aim. What other nation has ever been subjected to such sermons? Several generations of Russians have been brought up on such a horrendous version of Russian history that all they want to do is to try and forget we ever had a past at all. Russia was the gendarme of Europe and the prison of the peoples. Its history consisted of one defeat after another, and was always characterized by one and the same phrase, the accursed past. Even the broom of new names that has swept away everything linking us with our past has scarcely affected another people more cruelly than the Russian. Let me suggest a simple experiment for those who wish to try it. Get on a bus passing through the center of Moscow and listen to the names of the stops as the driver calls them out. It will immediately strike you that streets retaining their old original names are rare exceptions. It is as if some brush had painted out all reminders of the fact that the Russian people once had a history. 4. Similarly, with the suppression of religion. The Russian Orthodox Church was suffering its first blows, while Islam, for example, was still being handled with kid gloves. In this first push, indeed, an important role was assigned to the exploitation of the religious politics of other nations. For example, an independent, autocephalous Georgian church was set up, and attempts were made to create a similar church in the Ukraine. 5. It is only with the fifth and last of the above arguments that one cannot disgrace. All this activity is indeed taking place mainly in the Russian language as the state language of the USSR. But what do the Russians gain from that? Other painful features of national life are also worth mentioning. Above all, the catastrophic decline of the village, which has always been the mainstay of national identity. But in this respect, too, the Russians have suffered no less than other peoples. I think the theory of Russian colonialism is not only unfair to the Russians, but also erroneous in fact, and therefore damaging to the other peoples by impeding a proper understanding of their own national life. In fact, the basic features of national life in the USSR are a direct result of the hegemony in our country of socialist ideology. This ideology is the enemy of every nation, just as it is hostile to individual human personality. It is able to exploit the aspirations of this or that people temporarily for its own purposes, but its fundamental trend is toward the maximum destruction of all nations. The Russians, no less than others, are its victims. Indeed, they were the first to come under fire. If we accept this view of how nations came to their present pass, we must correspondingly adjust our practical attitude to present problems. Since the blame for the present situation cannot be laid on one people's door, it follows that to a certain extent all the peoples are to blame. This seems a more constructive view to me, since it frees our minds from bondage to external causes, over which we generally have no control, and instead concentrates them on causes hidden within ourselves, over which by definition we have much more control. A similar dilemma confronts the individual. Is the fundamental course of his life determined by external factors, material circumstances, social environment, and so on, or is it inherent in himself? In the final analysis, the question is one of free will. The same question confronts the nation. But if one acknowledges the preeminence of inner causes, if one acknowledges that a nation's fate is determined more by its own actions and outlook on life than by external factors, then it follows that the inner causes will not be changed by simply breaking with the Russians. In other words, once the concept of colonization has been exploded, the concept of decolonization also needs rethinking. All I mean by this is that we must rid ourselves of certain habits of thought, of the unverifiable and undebatable conviction that breaking away from the Russians and creating one's own state is the automatic solution to all the problems of every nation. I think I see here a profound analogy to the position of those Russian intellectuals who gave in to the temptation to take a novel and, for us, quite new and unusual way out of their situation by immigrating. In both cases, there is an underlying wish to escape from your own shadow, to solve by external means problems that are essentially within. We have all had a hand in creating the problems that now confront us. The Russian nihilists, the Ukrainian Boratbists, the Latvian riflemen, and many others have each done their bit. How can we hope, separately, to disentangle the knot that we all helped to tighten? Our forefathers unanimously declared Russia to be the prison of the peoples, adding the words of their favorite battle cry, "We'll raze it to the ground, and after that." The razing of the prison of peoples was a phenomenal success. But after that, for example, a group of Estonian nationalists has written to the United Nations, claiming that the very existence of the Estonian nation is threatened. And they called for the final rupture of all relations with the peoples of the USSR, the expulsion of Russians and Ukrainians from Estonia, and the stationing of UN troops there. Has history not taught us at least this, that it is hardly the height of political wisdom to throw away centuries old alliances like useless trash, and that it is necessary to begin, not by razing to the ground, but rather by changing and improving? A common history has welded the nations of our land together. The experience it has endowed us with is unique in the world. No other peoples possess it. Strange as it may sound, in many respects we are now immeasurably further along the historical road than many peoples we are in the habit of only catching up with. The phase in which Western Europe and the USA now find themselves is remarkably reminiscent of the nihilist era in Russia, that is, the period of 100 years ago. Our experience and suffering lay a moral obligation on us. We are now able to perceive and tell the world things that nobody else can tell. This is where I see the historic mission of the peoples that inhabit what was once Russia and is now the Soviet Union. They can point the way out of the labyrinth in which mankind is now lost. And this is the only way in which any of our peoples can influence the fate of mankind, and hence their own fate. Each people must, of course, consult its own conscience and decide whether to take this mission upon itself. No nation must be judged or condemned for deciding one way or the other. But I trust it would not be regarded as tactless interference if I express my own opinion on this question, which is one that vitally affects us all. Why is it thought that different peoples cannot live within the bounds of a single state of their own free will and to the benefit of all? If they cannot, surely one is entitled to doubt that different individuals can do so. Recent decades, it is true, have shown the tendency toward the formation of even smaller states, but this by no means proved that the trend is correct. The small and minuscule states that have appeared in recent times are too weak. They are doomed, in all possible respects, to become dependents and hangers-on of larger states. They can acquire power only by acting together, subordinating their individuality to a common purpose, and always choosing the course of action that will offend nobody. In other words, the most trivial. That is the origin of mob rule by nations, a spectacle we are witnessing in the United Nations at the moment. But the process is still only in its infancy. At present, there are about 2,000 nations in the world, but only some 150 states. If the trend towards nation states continues, The existing states will have to be broken down by a factor of 10 or more. But even the formation of pocket handkerchief states brings no relief from familiar troubles. We see that they are plagued by the same sores of international and intertribal strife. Yet, this is the ideal solution propounded in many a samizdat study of the national question. One of them even suggested the interesting idea that there is nothing to prevent any village declaring itself a state. It is worth thinking this idea through in earnest and trying to picture such a state. Who will supply it with the simplest agricultural machinery and electric light? Where will it find its teachers and doctors? And what if all mankind follows this happy example and splits itself up into villages? One has only to imagine it, and it becomes clear how much the author of this theory is prepared to sacrifice for the sake of universal separatism. There is nothing to indicate the necessity of dismembering states into national atoms. On the contrary, different peoples in cooperation can give birth to a culture of a higher quality than any of them in isolation. However large the nation, its culture acquires a new dimension it would not otherwise have. And the geniuses of small nations achieve worldwide significance, something that would be impossible unless they were part of a more powerful kindred culture, as the Scotsman Walter Scott was of the greater English culture. But the most vivid illustration comes from our own culture. I refer, of course, to Gogol. Great as his genius was, I do not think he could have blossomed so profoundly or attained such a pinnacle of human achievement had he not been enriched by Russian culture. And his influence on mankind would have been negligible if all Russian culture had not been illuminated with his light. Similarly, with Shevchenko, his prose in Russian demonstrates his desire to be a Russian as well as a Ukrainian writer. I believe this path is not closed to the peoples of our country, but finding it will not be at all easy. It will require much effort and goodwill, and changes in our usual attitudes. It would be a great pity if readers were to think that I am advocating this effort for the non-Russian peoples only. In many respects, it is precisely the Russians who ought to be breaking their old habits. I do not think Russians suffer from the national arrogance that Western Europeans display in their relations with their European neighbors, or even more toward non-Europeans. Russians mix easily with other peoples, and often place too low a value on their own culture. But power mania is the vice of every great nation, and is not at all foreign to the Russians. If a large country's armies are unloosed against a small neighbor, and if they successfully carry it off, then the overwhelming majority of the populace feels pride and satisfaction. This has unfortunately been the psychology of many nations for centuries past, and the Russians are no exception. But if we want to preserve even the shadow of a hope of living side by side in one state with our present neighbors, we cannot permit ourselves this anymore. And therefore, when the journal Veshe, Assembly, begins its existence by describing Skobelev's conquest in Central Asia, as if the most important wars in our history were those that subjugated other peoples, it looks like some sort of deliberate provocation. But in our attitude to other nations, there is another vice that is typically Russian: the inability to see the line that divides us from other nations, the lack of inner conviction in their right to exist within their own national identity. How often have I heard Russians wondering naively why the Ukrainians, Belarusians, or Lithuanians won't learn proper Russian and turn into proper Russians? All the jokes, mockery, and tactless puns on the Ukrainian language have their root in an unwillingness to recognize the Ukrainians as a separate nation, and in a failure to understand why these Russians so strangely distort our language. This may be due to a perversion or misunderstanding of our national sense of equality, for we tend to think of all these people as our equals, and immediately, without consulting them, class them as Russians. But it is easily to understand how other peoples, especially small ones, are horrified and infuriated by the sight of the immense Russian tide advancing on them, ready to swallow them up without a trace. Most animals capable of killing their own kind are endowed by nature with inhibitions, which make such killings impossible. No wolf can tear open the throat of another wolf vanquished in battle. No raven can peck out the eye of another raven. Neither men nor nations are equipped with the same inhibitions. They can instill them only by a process of spiritual development. This is the task facing the Russian people. We cannot count on our neighbors for sympathy or even absence of hostility unless we can not only see the Estonians, for example, as people equal to ourselves in every respect, but also realize how much our life has been enriched by the proximity of this small, courageous people, who are prepared to make any sacrifice other than renounce their national individuality. Is the picture I have endeavored to paint here a feasible one? I very much want to hope it is. But to be honest, I am not sure it will work out. There is too much deep-seated resentment, and perhaps too little time left to neutralize it. And perhaps the national question is the most distressing one, simply because it is the most difficult. It demands that such complexly organized and individual entities as nations should learn to live together without losing their individuality. And perhaps we should be looking for other, less obvious ways of solving it. But of one thing I am convinced. This question is insoluble unless we renounce our ingrained prejudices and what Dostoevsky called shortcuts to thought. It is insoluble on a basis of hatred and mutual recrimination, and these must be abandoned. To this end, we must endeavor to change habits that have been built up over decades and centuries, transforming the forces of repulsion into forces of attraction. This is essential not at all simply in order to try to preserve the links that exist between our country's peoples. Everyone with a responsible attitude toward the destiny of his own people, however he regards its future, should feel bound to exert every effort in the same direction. Some affinity of outlook and a certain ability to understand one another are essential, not only in order to be able to live together, but also in order to be able to part company. As V. Maklakov once intriguingly put it, nationalists generally demand plebiscites, believing that, so long as the majority in their region plump for secession, they should be granted independence. In other words, they believe the question can be settled by a majority vote in their region, although they are, of course, a minority in the state as a whole. Conversely, their will, which is a minority one in the state as a whole, is supposed to prevail, while the majority in their own region, who oppose secession, must bow to the majority. Of course, there can come a moment in the history of nations when all spiritual links are broken, and living together in one state only exacerbates mutual animosity. But Maklakov's idea strikes me as an interesting paradox, which demonstrates, by taking a logical conclusion to absurdity, that neither plebiscites nor the introduction of United Nations forces can solve the delicate and organic problems facing the nations of today. Whatever the ultimate solutions may be, the only healthy path to it is through the rapprochement of peoples. The only alternative that remains is the path of force, along which each solution is doomed to be only temporary and to lead inexorably to the next, even graver crisis. There are at least real grounds for hope that in many respects the lessons of the past have not been totally wasted on our peoples. Our experience has inoculated us against many temptations, but not all. Class hatred can probably never again light the flame that engulfed our house in time of trouble, but national hatred easily could. We can feel its warning tremors already, and they enable us to judge how destructive it could be once it erupted onto the surface. We must not be so naive as to suppose that any man could direct this elemental force into acceptable channels. The forces of hatred and violence are subject to their own laws and always consume those who unleash them. And who can say which nations will survive yet another cataclysm? perhaps more terrible than any they have been obliged to endure so far. Herein lies the last reason for the extreme acuteness of the national question. It may well become a question of the continued existence of our peoples.